Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today, we have Jonathan Church with us. Jonathan Church is an economist, a very prolific writer, and he just wrote the book Reinventing Race. And you can find all this, and I'll put this in our show notes as well, on his website, jonathandavidchurch.com. So, Jonathan, before we get started today, what are you drinking for this conversation, if anything?
Just a bottle of water. There it is. I'm a pretty sober person overall. By the way, I would just say, not that it's a big concern to me, but the title is Reinventing Racism. But the only reason I mention that is because it's the ism that I sort of take issue with. But at any rate, it's not a big deal, but just water. When we were in the office, as you know, now it's all telework, which allows me to sign off and do this. But when I was in the office, I drink 2 cups of green tea every day as well. So, but for some reason, I haven't continued that at home.
Well, I actually am doing water too. I mean, it's a little more exciting. It's a watermelon sparkling water, but yeah, today is not a drinking day for me. David, what about you?
So I'm doing red wine once again, and I
nice.
poured it about 45 minutes ago because I had a Zoom before this, and I've been nursing it since then. So I'm not sure I'm going to be at my best, but we'll see. So thank you, Jennifer.
Well, Jonathan, I've got the first question for you, but I did want to say thank you for correcting. I'm sure we're going to get into it, why it's racism that's very important versus race. And so my apologies on getting the title incorrect. But this is my question for you, and we can get into it. You're an economist. And I have to tell, and a prolific writer, but an economist. And I have to confess, as someone who studied political science, international relations, and now I find myself very much in this critical social justice landscape, I oftentimes wish I was a mathematician or a doctor, or I chose something that was just like, it was just the numbers, because it's kind of dangerous in this world now. And so you're an economist. What got you interested in social justice, in reinventing racism, in your new book that obviously is something that is very important to you? Oh, and by the way, I don't think you know this. I'm really excited to meet you because the first alternative supplemental guide I gave to the 21-day racial reading equity challenge, which Counterweight published a while ago, one of your pieces was in that. So, and it was on White Fragility. So how did you go from being an economist to having this interest in critical social justice?
So I first just wanted to say real quick that it's not a real big deal about the title. I mean, in some sense, I sometimes think that I should have had a better title in terms of just making white fragility more prominent as opposed to being in the subtitle, because it ultimately is a critique of Robin DiAngelo's theory of white fragility. But I mean, I'm not a promotional guy, so I actually was kind of aiming at a certain theme, which really is about reinventing racism. So it might not have the same kind of ring to it, but it actually is all about that. But, at the same time, I guess maybe is evident here is maybe not as catchy. So, but anyway, with that said, I guess you could say that, or I could say, that I've had an interest in these types of issues for many years. And I say that in the sense that back when I was in college, I kind of went from a somewhat right-leaning high school student to a more left-leaning college student. And one of the first things I wrote as a freshman in college was an op-ed for the paper about the underprivileged and so on. Which, by the way, these days is somewhat problematic to say underprivileged because supposedly you're normalizing privilege. That's the whole reification fallacy or issue and whatever. But that kind of leads into subsequent discussions on this. But so that was one op-ed I wrote, which I actually can find online now. But and then I got into critical theory, and more specifically the Frankfurt School. And that I kind of got interested in through philosophy. I ended up just sort of by luck. I just took a course. I don't even quite know why I chose it, but I ended up taking a course with a professor who I really liked, and I ended up taking about 5 or 6 with him, and all about continental philosophy and all that stuff, but particularly the Frankfurt School. And I got on board with it. I actually really was a fan of it back then. I think it's kind of it's gone in many directions, critical theory, that is. And I still have a certain soft spot for, the Adornos and the Horkheimers, and I could talk about that. But at any rate, you could say it's kind of rooted in there. But at the same time, I was studying economics, and I went out to the private sector, and for several years, I was getting into doing economics. I got interested in foreign policy, the wake of the war and everything. But I have a sibling who's been very active in social justice stuff for many years, and so some back and forth conversations over the years. But I'd say sometime around, as everybody seems to recognize now, somewhere around maybe 2013, 14, 15 or so, this stuff really started to ramp up and take on resonance with a lot of people. And somewhere around 2016. Early 2016, I started writing a weekly column for the Good Men Project, which is a very progressive outlet, and they're very interested in social justice issues. So I was writing about those and other stuff, personal essays and everything and stuff like that. But there was one article I wrote. It was about whether social justice activism is susceptible to confirmation bias. So one of the central problems I have with, or issues or concerns that I have with a lot of this is the extent to which you have a worldview or a framework which is rigidly applied to various phenomena that we observe in society, in the world, and so on. And so it's less of a flexible conceptual framework that we can sort of adjust according to the circumstances, and more of a rigid framework where we take anything we see and sort of shoehorn it through this framework. And so I think in this particular case, it had to do with an article by somebody in the Federalist about the difference between sexual harassment and sexual tension. Or anyway, it's been a while. I should actually remember what I wrote, but I can't say I do right now because the overall point is just applies to everything about where you have. And so anyway, I sent this article to my sibling who said, why do you always get so defensive about, white privilege and social justice and so on? I didn't realize that I had been, but I don't really think I was, because at the same time I was writing articles, and I have many articles that I've written actually supporting various social justice initiatives, which then essentially sheds light on what we're dealing with here, which is that any sort of skepticism or questioning or any sort of pushback or just doubts seems to be unacceptable, and that when I really only raise the question about whether confirmation bias is a problem, immediately the question is, you're fragile. And I think I wrote this in mid-2018. I'm pretty sure. So that must be why fragility came up, because D'Angelo's book had been released that summer. So obviously my sibling would have been aware of that. And so that came up, why so fragile? Why so fragile? And I guess I'll finish up by saying I was driving back from Myrtle Beach, I think, for family thing, and I stopped in a rest stop because I was thinking about this and started texting up a whole bunch of thoughts to myself, which then ended up turning into an article for Colette later that month, and then it just sort of took on a life of its own. I wrote, over a dozen essays and a book about it because White Fragility seemed to encapsulate so much of the. I say this hesitatingly because I don't necessarily think that it's all bad, but some sort of growing intolerance that you observe within the so-called critical social justice activist movement.
So you talked about how there was this sort of perceptible ideological shift. You said 2013, 2014. It's interesting. I was the head of a nonprofit organization that dealt with college students at that time. And prior to 2014, I noticed that a lot of the students embraced what I would have called a soft form of postmodernism. All narratives are equal. Everybody has a story. Everybody's story is equal. No one organization or people has a better claim than any other. It was sort of this narrative framework that they brought to their student activism and the like. Around 2014, I noticed a huge shift. And I'm trying to understand what happened around then that would have affected. Is it just a new generation? Did we go from millennials to Gen Z, or was there something, perhaps Black Lives Matter, that came onto the scene that shifted the ideological parameters? What's your theory of that?
I don't have anything definitive to say about that, but if I were to offer a hypothesis, which would have to be investigated and tested and thought about and criticized and all that, is that it was a latent tendency that had sort of been growing. So I think that that when did Trayvon Martin, when did that happen?
I think that was around 2014,
and
right,
then
when the trial was taken. Ferguson
Yeah.
was 2016, I think. 2015, okay. 2016.
Well, at any rate, you had some very, legitimate protest movements that arose at the time, and I think Black Lives Matter arose at that. But anyway, I mentioned those because those became very, obviously became headline events that everybody was concerned about, and they ended up. I would say that sort of perhaps, and again, I say this only contingently, but perhaps gave a impetus to latent tendencies within more long-term activist scholarly circles, which in my view had been sort of building for many years. In fact, back when I was in college with study of critical theory and so two things. I guess the easier one to start with is that when I was in college, there was concern back then about left-wing politics among professors in academia. I had joined a student-run magazine for a little while, which was a little bit more of a conservative, and they had a whole history of defending sort of free speech type stuff that particularly was relevant at Penn, which is where I was in light of the so-old water buffalo affair in the early 90s.
Yes.
So they were really against campus speech codes and other stuff. But, it was the 90s, and, it was all about Wall Street and growth and, the victory of liberalism and capitalism after the fall of communism, whatever. So while this sort of left-wing sort of presence on the university, it was there already, but it didn't yet have the national voice, perhaps, that it has now, at least in terms of what we're talking about, critical theory, social justice, because, it was the golden 90s, whatever, and we were just kind of coming out of the Cold War, which, for the 70s and 80s at least, had sort of provided a unifying force, being against communism and so on. And, we had the 60s and 70s, but then it kind of petered out over time, particularly with some of the more, violent forms of activism in the 70s. But it really, I would say, you can trace it intellectually back to like, Hegel, Kant, whatever. But I would say the 60s were key. And a lot of the activists of the 60s seemed to, sort of gravitated towards academia over the long term as sort of this, what you might call Gramscian Antonio Gramsci project of sort of war position, taking over the institutions and so on. I mean, that's my theory. I mean, you'd have to make that case, but I'd say a good part of this is just 60s activists gravitating to the university, and then over the course of decades, developing the theories that ultimately became critical social justice. You have postmodernism, you have critical theory, you have a lot of different strains. And I don't want to take away from their concerns about, justice issues, but they were certainly developing a certain kind of theory, critical justice or critical theory and postmodern, whatever, which I would say gained, I don't know if I want to say majority status, but by the 90s it was there. And then for a little while in the 2000s with Bush and the Iraq War, it kind of, all those sort of left-wing energies were channeled through that, I'd say. But then that kind of petered out, and you had the election of Barack Obama, and Barack Obama was seemingly the post-racial president, but that was never, for a little while, it was that whole, hope and change stuff, but he never challenged the establishment in the way that real, what do I say, the real committed activists always wanted to do. And so there was a sort of disappointment, perhaps. And meanwhile, this undercurrent, this intellectual undercurrent, is continuing to establish itself in the university. And then, eventually you have these just social movements that arose, and it kind of all melded together. So anyway, I mean, I'm kind of just meandering, I guess, at this point, but it's an historical account that I've wanted to work out for myself for some time. I haven't fully done so, but I guess to sum up, I would say it's always been latent, and it just sort of it rose to a new level, I guess, once some very visible acts of injustice had occurred that were then sort of shoehorned through this critical social justice framework.
Right. And it became so manifest that it actually left the university, it left activist circles, and it ended up in corporate America. And that's what I wanted to ask you about. So you've written extensively about Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and how do you characterize Robin DiAngelo's ideas about diversity in the workplace?
So, diversity in the workplace in particular.
Or about racism in the workplace, however you choose to answer it. What's her core philosophy, belief system about race and how it should play out and how it should be different in the workplace?
Well, there is so I saw this podcast interview with Neil Shenby, and I mentioned that because I want to credit him. He summarized the 4 core tenets, as he sees it, of critical race theory, which I think is fairly accurate. One is that racism is permanent and pervasive; it's everywhere. 2, that it's hidden, ideologically, discursively. So you have things like colorblindness, universalism, and that sort of thing, and in particular, whiteness. And that we can talk about this, learn about it, investigate it by talking about so-called lived experience. And then there's the 4th idea of intersectionality, which is basically that it's all interconnected: classism, racism, sexism, and so on. So, with that's the framework she's operating from the literature and so on. I would say that her more narrow focus is on so-called whiteness. and white fragility is what she calls one aspect of whiteness. But because it comes from her reading of the whiteness studies literature and critical race theory and whatever, it's really ultimately a theory about what racism is and how white people advance or support or reinforce racism. And so I guess in her view is essentially that that of the critical whiteness studies field, and that racism is a system, and that it stands on a scaffold of ideologies and discourses, which she describes as the ideological ideologies and discourses of whiteness. I mean, I can look it up real quickly to quote her, but so what I've been trying to do right now is resist saying basically that all white people are racist. I mean, that is what her view is, but I mean, I guess that's your answer. But the reason I've been hesitating to say that is because it requires, some working out of what she means by that. So the first thing I suppose to say is that she wants to get away from what you might call an old school view of racism, which is that it's about good and bad, or good and bad, about race prejudice and whatever, but it's more about sort of prejudice plus power. And it's about the system within which that prejudice might manifest. So that if you're a member of a dominant group, you can't really be racist because you're part of the dominant group, and if you can exhibit prejudice, but not racism. I mean, I take issue with that, but the way it operates for her is just by the way we talk, and the ways in which we not only talk but act, the habits, social customs, the movies that we see, the music that we listen to, the posters that we put on our walls, the artwork that we're attracted to. I mean, just about everything. I mean,
but it sounds like a dominant. What she's talking about is a dominant culture, and in every society on earth, every organization has a dominant culture.
Yeah, that is one.
So why is it supremacist or systemically racist to have a dominant culture? Is that what she's essentially arguing here?
Well, she's saying that there's a connection between the fact that there's a dominant culture and that there are persistent, ongoing disparities and inequalities. So, I mean, for instance, I think Orlando Patterson wrote in the early 90s in the wake of the Clarence Thomas trial that, it really was kind of indisputable that among all the developed, or I forget how he words it, but that America was the least racist white majority society in the world, and he essentially made his case for that in a New York Times editorial, based on laws that had been developed, decline of explicit discrimination, whatever. And she would take issue with saying that, hey, we've got Clarence Thomas and Thurgood Marshall and other people. I'm just bringing in examples from her book. Colin Powell, Marco Rubio, other people who are in positions of power, and Barack Obama, but they don't actually challenge the system itself. So her view is that the system itself is racist, and that it ultimately operates culturally. I mean, there's cultural racism, which she doesn't really define very well in her books. There's a aversive racism. There's colorblind racism, but yeah, I mean, essentially, one criticism is basically that you can make, which to me is perfectly valid and legitimate and goes without saying to me, is that ultimately all we're talking about is a dominant culture. It's just all we're talking about.
Right.
But her view is that dominant culture does in fact perpetuate inequalities.
How did all this find its way into the corporate world, where you have major companies and hedge funds and investment banks buying into this and holding trainings with Robin DiAngelo? How'd that happen?
White Fragility says that or theory says that in accordance with whiteness studies that, and people like James Baldwin and then subsequent people like Barbara Applebaum at France,
Mhm.
but basically that the problem of racism lies with white people. It's not. It should not be the burden of people of marginalized people of color and so on. Now, I mean, I agree with that too, in the sense that we all have to sort of work together to figure out how to erase these sort of systematic disparities, and that we need to come up with policies that create equal opportunity and dignity and respect and all that for everybody. But white fragility is the idea that it's implicit bias, unconscious, and that if you don't really get on board with changing the way that you think and talk and act and so on, and all these sort of various idiosyncratic um, ways, that you're not helping. You're complicit. You're basically fragile, and you're if you express. So what I'm getting at, to answer your question, is that it's kind of white fragility is a catchy phrase that seems to offer a way forward. Because so one of the back last summer, somebody called me, Rahm Emanuel's brother, actually, Ariel Emanuel, after an
The
article he
the
wrote.
movie guy, the Hollywood guy, is Ariel.
I believe so. But anyway, he had all his employees reading White Fragility, and I had just written an article, Art Digital, which is got like 100,000 whatever. So it kind of came to his attention. His view was that what he saw in it was framing, the idea of framing. So you see this idea of the white racial frame in Joe Fegan's work and so on. But basically, the racism is all about the fact that white people generally think in certain ways that are alike. There's a sort of collective unconscious, and so you want to bring in. It just seems to offer an easy answer. It's like implicit bias training, or reading white fragility, or it's just something that's out there, which the Illuminati believe is effective, and because there's so much concern now about a lot of legitimate concerns about justice and so on. Um, Somebody in some corporation does a little research and says, "Hey, people are reading and talking about what Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi or whatever," and so they're the recognized experts. So let's bring them in and help. I mean, that's the only really. That's all I can think. I mean, I don't know. I There's so much that you can think and see in history that is just passing fads that ultimately faded out. I mean, I remember when I was in elementary school, you had DARE, DAR. I forget what it even stands for, but it was about drug resisting drugs or whatever. And then it just kind of petered out. And I mean, I don't know, maybe it's similar here, but it just seems like a catchy way that, or it just seems like this is what the Illuminati say we should do, so let's do it. It's the best I can say, Ray, about that.
I'm going to go out of the workplace for a second because you said something earlier that concerns me. I was having a conversation with my friend, the CEO of the China Bush Foundation, David Firestein, and we were talking. China's are both of our specialty, and you had mentioned how things when we had the Iraq War, things kind of calmed down because it was something that took our ideas off of our own internal um, angst or whatever in the United States. And one of the things that I was talking about with him, and that was really concerning, was things have reached such a crescendo right now in the United States. Are we going to find another enemy? I mean, is that the only way that we might be able to pull back from that brink? And David and I were talking, just because China is China, and obviously it makes a good bad guy, right? I mean, is there a way that we can pull back from that brink without finding a common enemy outside of the United States?
not that this is intended as a segue of any sort, but that is actually one of the main goals, purposes. I don't know, of this new book that I'm working on, which is attempting to not divert, but change the conversation. Maybe. I mean, I'm just one guy, so I don't have 30 years of whole field behind me, but I can do what I can do. But basically, just get away from talking about identity politics and talk about personal virtue, which is sort of a Stoic view, and also Spinoza, which there's a lot of overlap there. So I'm going to talk about him too. But the idea there is that there's this theme of cosmopolitanism that not that I have to go into all the Stoics and Logos and Spinoza and God and nature and all that, but the idea that there's a sort of total reality that we're all part of, and that we all sort of manifest this universal substance and logos and whatever. But one of the chief concerns of Stoicism is the cultivation of virtue, and there's four of them: it's, wisdom, moderation, courage, and justice. Justice is one of the four, and so Stoicism is very much about justice, and it's also very much about wisdom. And so you have to be able to the exercise of reason is big as well, and the exercise of reason to sort of cultivate wisdom, to sort of understand what we should be pursuing in terms of justice. And what is justice? Well, you have to sort of analyze that issue by issue, but one of the central, very elementary ideas for me is just the idea that we would treat people with dignity and respect regardless of whatever social identity group they're a part of, and that is ultimately the type of thing that I'm sort of interested in cultivating. And that while ideas like intersectionality are not sort of without merit, I don't think that they merit being the central area of focus, and I think they can be very divisive. I was just reading recently a passage from Epictetus, who's a Stoic philosopher, about why would you say I'm an Athenian? Why would you say I'm from Corinth? Why wouldn't you say I'm a citizen of the world? So that's a sort of idea that I'm getting at. So that's I guess that's my sort of alternative way of thinking about it. Is more of an individualist but cosmopolitan than ethical foundation, as opposed to this identity politics collectivist type of ethical foundation. Anyway, that's how I think about it.
Well, and I love that you're bringing Stoicism into. I just recently got into Stoicism a little bit myself, and so I'd love to hear more about your thoughts. But that might be the answer. And I do see more discussion about Stoicism in the public sphere. So hopefully that does provide an alternative to, let's say, going to war with China. But for me, tell me, I want to hear more about. Let me tell you what Stoicism means to me, and then correct me or add to it. But for me, it really is one of those things where it's just like looking at the world, good, bad, whatever. And I hesitate because I don't know much about it to say neutral, but it's just kind of accepting things as they are. And my one problem with Stoicism is it works really well for me when things are going bad, right? This is life, forge ahead, don't overthink think it, control what you can control. But I really love to get excited about awesome opportunities, even though they might fall through. I'm an easily excitable person, so I don't really fall on the Stoic side when it comes to happy things, if you will. But I love the idea of Stoicism, and I think that you really hit something unique as a way to use it as something that could actually heal our divide.
I would say though that the Stoics, I guess I would distinguish between lowercase Stoicism and uppercase Stoicism, where the latter is referring to the philosophy, and the philosophy is about sort of serenity and all that. But they also have something called, I don't know if they say it or whether it's Massimo Pigliucci's well, actually, they actually might say, but anyway, they have this notion of preferred indifference. Indifference. In other words, yeah, I mean, it's not like you should live your life around the idea of pursuing wealth as opposed to pursuing virtue. But if you can have wealth, it's a good thing, and there's nothing wrong with being happy about it. Just as the same with good health and anything else. Whether you're good at sports or winning a competition or whatever. So it's something to be preferred. It's just not something that should overwhelm you or consume you in a way that, or at the expense of your sort of virtue, serenity, what have you. But at any rate, yes, I don't know how successful it would be, but that is sort of the idea that I've been sort of really trying to work out. Is Stoicism as an alternative way to think about issues of justice.
Won't the critical social justice crowd just say that's just a form of privilege because it's meant to maintain the current system that is favorable toward whites and white adjacent folks? Won't they just say you're just trying to get people to be resigned to the world as it is rather than trying to solve the inequities?
They can say that. I would just argue that they're wrong. Now, there is a certain sense in which Stoicism or Spinoza, in particular, and perhaps more so Spinoza, but he really just sort of more systematically works out the notion of a sort of pantheistic universe. But there is a sense of like, acceptance. So, for instance, one of the ways this plays out is with microaggressions. And I have a really big problem with the notion of microaggressions. But one thing that a Stoic, and I think it's Bill Irvine who actually writes about this, but the idea, but it's part of cognitive behavioral therapy as well, but the idea of developing quote unquote insult pacifism, which is the idea that you don't just get worked up by every little sort of slight that you come across. And that, we'll work this out, but I don't want to go on a tangent or anything. And so, you might get the response, particularly the response that I've been reading about white regressions, Monica Williams or whatever. The idea is that these things are, these slights and insults or whatever, the subtle slights, are part of a larger system and that they're everywhere. And if you don't fight them, if you don't point them out, the system just persists. Now, I have a lot of problems with that just because I'm not a big fan of systems and whatever. I don't think everything comes down to, because one of the major problems is the idea that this thing is just never ending. I mean, D'Angelo will say that the anti-racism is lifelong work. It's never going to, it just never ends and so on. And that what you have is it's like in the very DNA of society, and and it's similar with like microaggressions. Is that you just got to constantly be looking for microaggression, again, confirmation bias. And what that does, it develops this hypersensitivity, which is what you see in this Generation Z, right? Safetyism and all that. It's just not cultivating resilience. It's undermining CBT and so on. So yeah, I mean, they're going to say you're not fighting the system and you're not changing the system, but I think that's a misreading of Stoicism in the sense that, again, as Jennifer mentioned, it's about what you can control versus what you can't control. And so it's Stoicism is the exercise of reason, to cultivate your wisdom, to be able to recognize what's in your control, what's not in your control, and working out what it means to be in control and not in control is another aspect of cultivating your wisdom. But the issue is it is a philosophy of agency in the sense that you are directing your attention to the things that you can change for the bit. It is in the interest of justice, but the impetus is from the individual and developing a sense of cosmopolitanism as the individual himself develops it. So it's not a philosophy of passivity. It's not a philosophy of simply standing in the rain for the sake of standing in the rain and doing nothing about it. But it is about sort of being ready to endure rain if you happen to get stuck in a rainstorm by accident. So yeah, I think that that is something that you probably would hear, but I would dispute it in the way that I was disputing it.
Is your book that you're working on Stoicism, is it like we've been talking directly to kind of address where we are in society today and as a resolution to our current division and tension?
Yeah, I mean, the idea is really, it really ultimately is about trying to reconcile. So, um, I don't, for instance, support the banning of critical race theory. Um, First of all, I think that there is merit to some of the more scholarly, Charles Mills, for instance, is someone I respect. I don't. I wish he would. I mean, his book on the social contract, racial contract. I mean, the thing that you can see in Mills is he has a deep understanding of Western philosophy, and then kind of runs with that in terms of white ignorance and social epistemology, whatever. I have issues with that. Then intersectionality has some sort of common sense. The idea that you can look at people as parts of race or class or sex, whatever. And I mean, I'm not going to deny that there's insight to be gleaned into that. And
Sure.
my view is that uh, there's also, and particularly for me, at least in the whiteness literature, there's a lot of flawed thinking as well, and that we should be open to being able to critique it. And so CRT should be one of many different ways we can think about. So we should be able to critique it. But what you
We
have,
just wrote an essay on this, Jonathan.
okay,
Jennifer and I, and Amna Khalid from Carleton College, just wrote an essay saying that we shouldn't ban CRT. We should teach it critically as we
yeah.
would other theoretical lenses.
But
So we're totally
unfortunately,
on the same page.
yeah, unfortunately, what you kind of, I mean, this is sort of impressionistic in a sense. I mean, I haven't done the rigorous study, but what you see is essentially an us versus them type of thing. Now, so you have that chart that was controversial last summer in
The
the
Smithsonian chart,
Smithsonian.
yes,
You
yeah,
know,
the
the
whiteness traits.
yeah,
Yeah.
objectivity and
Time sensitivity.
yeah, stuff like that. Now, um, in the end, I mean, it was somewhat problematic to say that. I think it was, if you really work hard or something, you can be successful. It's obviously very problematic to say that that's something that's white as opposed, because it's actually kind of racist in a sense. I mean, at least people would say. And so I think that the museum was correct to take down that chart. But at the same time, if you read the website, you know, there is something to be said to talk about, examining the ways in which white supremacy in some way or manifest. I mean, there is room for introspection and self critique as to how white people might um, uh, not be entirely helpful to the movement to undo inequalities and racial disparities and so on. The issue is for people who are critical of critical race theory not to then become very smug in congratulating themselves for having convinced the Smithsonian to take down the chart, but rather be grateful that they did, and then maybe be able to reciprocate by sort of acknowledging that it's helpful to talk about some of the more positive aspects of what whiteness studies is trying to achieve. So basically, trying to achieve that kind of reconciliation. Now, for me, the ideal leader, Stoic leader, if you will, is Abraham Lincoln, who obviously was navigating an even more polarized society at the time. And so he had to make a lot of compromises that are not something that the more sort of doctrinaire social justice activists today are happy with. This sort of became an issue at University of Wisconsin Madison.
Right.
And for instance, they invoke a quote from the Douglas debate, in which he clearly says, I'm in favor of the separation of races with white on top or whatever. but to basically conclude that he's not pro-black on the basis of this passage is very naive, because it really divorces it from the fact that he had been accused of advocating for racial equality all along. I mean, it was only in response to Stephen Douglas's constant race baiting throughout, and you're talking about 1858. Like, he started off, 2 sentences before that passage saying, I was in a hotel, an elderly gentleman comes up to me and says, are you really in favor of racial equality? And right there, the audience breaks out in laughter, as if that was like a sort of absurdity. So, I mean, it gives you a sense of what you're dealing with. Like, and so there's Doris Goodwin says, armies of scholars have looked through this and tried to find instances of Lincoln engaging in racial dignity. They haven't found any. Frederick Douglass talked about he was the only great man he had encountered in his life who did not look at me as and remind me of the difference between us, of the difference of. I mean, this is somebody, in my view, who was a quintessential anti-racist in terms of treating people with dignity and respect regardless of color. But then you have this passage, which, in the context of the politics of the time, is then taken from our perspective, the 20th century, and it's just a very naive reading, and it divorces it not only from the context, but prevents us from appreciating the extent to which, in the long term, Lincoln advanced the cause of racial equality by just orders of magnitude, because he understood the art of the positive, the possible, and made the possible the actual in the long run. And so, just those are the types of things that I'm trying to argue. To sum up, I'm running away from purity tests.
If I might say, you cut quite the Stoic figure yourself, Jonathan. I think you're going to do a great job living up to the ideal that you write about. It's.
Do I look like a Stoic, or do I?
You do. You look and talk like a Stoic. Am I wrong, Jennifer?
No, I'd agree. I'm looking forward to the book.
Is it a haircut? I don't know.
No, it's just a piece about you. I don't know. For me, that's what Stoicism is too. Because again, it's not really getting yourself worked up about what you can't control.
Yeah. Although I guess I was a bit animated in my defense of Lincoln.
I like hearing it.
Yeah.
But then again, that's also, recognizing the causal necessity of my animation. This is getting into Spinoza, but it's an active emotion as opposed to a passive emotion, because it comes from an adequate understanding of the causal force of my animation and so on. But anyway, that's Spinoza and the late revolution.
Well, with that, I'm almost done with my drink. David, any final questions from you?
No, I appreciate the time, and it's great to pick your brain, because you can really help us with the theoretical underpinnings of the work that we do and the conversations we're having. So thanks so much for that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.